Welcome everybody, my name is Anna. Welcome to this Gallery Teachers webinar. I'm Anna Cuccia and I'm a teacher trainer and school governor. Look forward to working with you today on the second of our webinars, which is about using Cuisenaire rods in the language classroom. Okay, so like with all my webinars, I just have a few things to ask of you before we start. Try really hard to put your phone out of reach, on silent, far away, so that you're not tempted to be looking at it during the webinar, and you can devote yourself, give yourself some special time just to learning about using the rods. I'm also going to ask you to try and avoid using Google. There might be a couple of things that you're not sure of or you don't know about. There is a lot of information on the Gallery Teachers website, all of the slides, all of the materials afterwards, and you'll have plenty of time to check things out. But what I would ask you to do instead is maybe make some notes. You might want to make some drawings. You might want to pause this video if you're not watching it live and it's a recording, and get some colored pens, pencils, so that you can follow the webinar and take some active notes. Okay, so let's move straight on. First of all, just checking that we remember what we're actually talking about. If you didn't come to the first webinar, please do watch it, but we looked at using Cuisenaire rods. In the picture, you can see a set of the wooden rods from the Cuisenaire company. And we did talk about the fact that there are also lots of other kinds of things on the market. This set happens to come from a European website, an Italian one. They're called Regole Colorati, and they're used for maths. It's a slightly cheaper way. It has to be said, they're not as nice as the real traditional rods from the Cuisenaire company that come both in wood, but also in this kind of, it's not plastic, I'm not quite sure what they are made of, but this format is very hard wearing. And for those of you that are new to the rods, the key things you can see on the screen are clearly you've got 10 different colors. And we talked last time about agreeing what you call those colors, because different people will perceive them in different ways, and some different sets will have slightly different colors. And noticing the most important part of the rods is that each rod differs by 1 centimeter in length. So we go from 1 centimeter to 10 centimeters, and we have those 10 different colors in our box of rods. This is a large class set. This is a smaller personal set. So let's think what else you can do with them. Now, hopefully you've already tried a few things, but we're going to start simple again. Thinking about, if you are new to them, just starting off with things like designing structures or pictures. This picture on the left I just wanted to share with you is an amazing sculpture that was in New Zealand in the town of Hamilton, a sculptor called Michael Parakowis, who made several things using the idea of Cuisenaire rods. And that sculpture is actually called The Tongue of the Dog. And I guess if you look at the way the water's flowing, you can see why. So you can do this two ways. You can design your own sculpture or structure, or you can ask students to do it. In this case, I've got two simple designs that I've already made. This one is a rough representation of maybe a cherry or an apple tree. And this one, if anybody's doing bonfire night or autumn stuff, is supposed to be a bonfire. So the students will work in pairs. Student A will either see this model or see the picture. And they will also see some text which will explain to the other person how to do it. So here's an example. So student A may dictate to their partner, lay 2 brown rods next to each other vertically. And that would be the start of building this. So one person is going to dictate an instruction. The other person is going to build the structure. And we've got some more examples here just of what those instructions might look like. So at the top of the brown rods, place a red rod horizontally, that's here, a light green either side. So you've got many, many options with this to practice with students. First of all, obviously, you're getting prepositions of place and location. You can ask the students to create a small structure themselves and write the actual dictated instructions, obviously check them, and then they could dictate that to another group to produce a structure of their own. You can provide the language for them and they're practicing. And obviously they're going to be able to check the accuracy of their understanding of these prepositions, adverbs of space and time, by looking at whether or not their structure is the same. Now, the important thing is clearly when you're giving a dictation, they must not see what it is supposed to look like in the end, because what is fun is at the end when they've built something to compare it with the original design. So this is by far one of the simplest things that you can be doing with rods. Moving on to another really simple thing we touched on this last time, but thinking about how you can work out syntax. So another grammatical area here. In this case, I've got an example with adverbs of manner, place, and time. It's up to you how you allocate the colors, but in this case, I've chosen for the subject to be red, the object is yellow, auxiliaries are sort of our purpley pink, whichever color you want to call that. My main verb is going to be the light green. And then I've got 3 for my adverbs. I've got blue for adverbs or adverbial phrases related to time, orange for adverbial phrases related to manner, which answer the question how. And the green ones, those related to place, are the dark green color. And what students are going to be doing is they're going to color code some sentences. So here's an example. We've got this girl, she's rubbing her head. Why, what happened? She, the subject, hit, that's our main verb. What, you have to hit something. Her head. How, on the door, last Sunday. So then we've got the time. So this is the first one. And we've got further examples here. So on the Gallery Teachers website, you'll be able to find this activity. For students, what I've done is I've started to divide up the clusters of manner, place, time, but I haven't done that for all of them. So the students would need to go through and they're going to identify here. We've got my boss, she, the car, he, they, you, etc. And then they're going to start color coding. So if we go back to the patterns, we'll look out for our main verbs. We've done the subjects in red. We look out for our main verbs. In this case, we've got went and drove and lives, and we would be highlighting those in the relevant color. So we've got drove, went, lives, etc. Going through the whole set with colored pens. But what they might want to do before is actually lay out some rods. If they're working in a group, they can lay out the rods on the table in front of them and start to build up what those sentences look like. Now, to show you the answers for these, the final thing, once they've actually laid out the rods or drawn in the patterns, they're going to end up with a set of colors, basically like this. So a map where they can see they've got the places, they've got the times are all in blue here, and they've got the how without any breaks, how in an ambulance, how beautifully, smoothly, and they're going to start seeing patterns. And what you're asking them to look for is then to think about the rules. How do we actually know which order we put them in? And to give you the answers as well, so that's also on the website, some sheets. So for our first example here, hit is transitive, it needs to take an object, you hit something. And the same in number 7, we've got you put something, you can't put in the suitcase, you've got to put something. We've got in number 5 and number 6, we have first of all how, where, when. If we have a verb of movement like in number 2 or number 3, so going and driving, then we do place, then manner after the verb of movement. And in number 4 and number 8, where we've got lots of green here, we go from specific to more generalized. So I guess smaller, the flat, then a bit bigger, the village, and then larger, Spain. Smaller, the desk, then the office, a bit bigger, and then which floor that is on. And with times, we go from smaller, 5 o'clock, bigger in the morning, even bigger, Saturday. And we start to see these patterns. So this is just a really nice cognitive approach to slowing down on our language, looking at what we're doing and trying to draw some conclusions. The students will enjoy manipulating the rods, trying to work out these patterns, trying to group the sentences. And what you can do, works for many things. So this is adverbs of manner, time, and place. This is an example of feedback that I had online after doing the same, looking at all sorts of different verbs, contrasting different structures, and here contrasting first, second, and third conditionals. But again, color coding for students. So this is what it looks like. Now, students, if they start with the rods and they make a mistake, they can move things around and then they can record the answers in colour on paper. Again, something simple, thinking about tenses, thinking about using the timeline, the rods to represent a timeline. Now, you might like to make some notes here and think about how you would actually draw that yourself. Now, traditionally, when we're teachers in the classroom, we tend to be drawing our timelines, and we're sort of drawing a line like this, and we're putting in that we've got our past and we have now and a sort of line and something about the future. And we tend to put things like wiggly lines and crosses on our timelines and label them. Well, that's fine, but also we can use the rods. So in this case, the red rod is going to represent the verb leave. We were eating when he left. Now you can see that that red rod is placed right in the middle of the blue. So it's sort of interrupting the action. So we were right in the middle of something and it continued beyond that. We can contrast that here with our past perfect. He had left when we ate. So the red rod has been and gone in this case. And doing the opposite thing, first we're going to eat and then he's going to leave. So again, you can give the sentence verbally and ask students to manipulate the rod to show you where the actions are happening. So you can say, use the red rod to be the verb leave. Where will you put it in relation to the blue rod? So this can just be a nice change on drawing these kind of lines. So we were eating when he left, that in fact would be this one. So we were in the middle of it, there was an interruption. We would want to also make sure that we mark what's happening, that the cross is the eating, sorry, the cross is the leaving, apologies, and the wiggly line is the eating. So we've got here our cross, left, and the wiggly line is going to be the were eating. Okay, and yeah, my timeline's a bit messy here. This is very crisp, clean, precise, and also nice where you're going to be able to very quickly move the rod to demonstrate different things. Okay, another thing that you can do is looking at simple controlled practice. Now, some of you may be aware of this game. This is the old-fashioned version that we had in the UK called Battleship. And in this game, you have basically two people and they cannot see all of each other's information. So you've got a hidden grid from yourself in order to play it. And what they do is they place some little counters here, and we're going to replace this with Cuisenaire rods to represent their battleship, their warships, which they are hiding on the grid. And then they ask each other questions using grid references to try to locate each other's ships. Now, how do we do this with rods? So first of all, you're going to need a grid. So this is one that's ready. And you're going to ask students to put some crosses on the grid and not show their partner. Now, in this case, I want it to be controlled practice. So you'll notice that my grid has adjectives, nationalities down this side, and down this side, I've got nouns, so that I'm going to get some language practice in. So putting 20 crosses on the grid, what might that look like? That might look like this. So here we've put 20 crosses on our grid. Our partner is not going to see those. And then what they are going to do is try to find their partner's different ones. So they're going to need to use a different color, and they're going to be asking questions. For example, do you have any Brazilian exports? If the person says no, they will put a circle if they haven't got a cross there. If the person said yes, so have you got any Italian personnel? They say yes, then that is a hit for me. And I'm using the red to show this in a different color. So here you can see these are two students that are actually playing this game. And how you can play it with rods is they've made their little wall between them using their books. And we place the rods onto the grid in whichever position we want. We can have as many rods as we feel fit that we would like to have. And again, we proceed in exactly the same way. So this student is going to say, have you got any German technical support? And it would be, no, I haven't. Have you got any French research? No, I haven't. Have you got any Thai personnel? Yes, I have. And then we would just record that we had a hit. So this is a very structured, controlled practice activity, a lot of repetition of the target language, and just using the rods makes that more kinesthetic, a little bit more engaging. You can do it simply with pen and paper, but I find that students enjoy using this. You logistically are going to need for them not to be able to see each other's work, obviously. I'd like to think a little bit now about storytelling, and this is by far one of my favorite ways of using rods. And for those of you maybe that are thinking about the Cambridge Delta experimental practice or looking at other methodologies, you may or may not have come across dogme. So dogme is an approach, it's been talked about a large amount by Scott Thornbury, but the key points of this particular method are that it is materials light. So we're not going to have loads of objects, loads of photocopies, loads of things. And Cuisenaire rods are perfect for being materials light. We just need the rods, nothing else. Dogme is also unplugged. So what does he mean by unplugged? He means we're not going to be using high-tech resources. We don't need video. We don't need audio. We don't need other things. So we can do that with rods as well. Dogme is also conversation-driven. Cuisenaire rods and the technique I'm about to show you are going to include a huge amount of conversation. In fact, they're going to be wholly conversation-driven at the beginning, so they meet the remit perfectly. And what happens with rods is you're going to get a lot of what we call emergent language. You don't plan. You're not sure what exactly is going to happen. So how would this work in a dogme lesson? You would very simply take a couple of rods, just a few rods, and as you can see on the screen, just take those and place them on the table. Sit with your students as a group, make it intimate, or if you're doing it online, use a webcam, and you put the rods down and you invite some suggestions. So you might use a gesture like, what could that be? And you're going to start trying to get some suggestions from the students, supporting them with positive gestures, smiles, interactions to encourage them, and see what they will come up with. Things will emerge. Somebody will say, oh, this is a road, and there are two buildings by the side of the road, and this is a car park. Or somebody might say, actually, this is a fallen down log, a tree, and these are some people that were out for a walk and they've come across this log. And then you're going to ask them what this could be. So rods lend themselves brilliantly to creating stories when you've got no idea what's going to happen. And it doesn't really matter what the story is. So this would be a materials-like, conversation-driven approach using the Cuisenaire rods, which follows very closely what dogme is about. Now, after the call, if you want to Google it and look up more, there is loads more to be said about this. So that might be something you could do as an experimental practice. Okay, I'd like to now think about telling you a story, and so that you can see what that might look like if the teacher tells the story. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a story. I absolutely love this story, even though it's actually quite sad. So here's what we need, and this is our main character. So this is John. And we've got a representation. This is John's house, and these are going to be officers and other people that we'll have in the story. So here goes. So the story is that John is feeling really sad, low, unhappy, because he hasn't had a job for a really long time. And what's happened is that he has been filling in some application forms and sending them off to different companies. And the companies call him in for an interview, but every time they say, no, not interested, don't want you. And they turn him down and he goes back home, no job. He gets called in for another interview. They listen to him. They don't like it. They turn him down. He goes back home. In fact, he just goes to bed because he's so sad and low. In fact, things are really bad for him. And his friends have even started to be really not very nice and look down on him and say, John, you haven't got new clothes, you haven't got any money, you never get out of bed, we're not interested in being friends with you anymore. So life is not good for John at this time. However, one night John goes to bed, and in the night he has a dream, and he thinks of this brilliant idea where companies can save tax. In the morning, he's very excited. He wakes up, he thinks, right, I'm going to send this idea off to a company and let them know. So he sends it off to the company, and the company calls him in for an interview. And they say to him, wow, this is an amazing idea. We really like this idea and we'd like you to work for us. And John gets a job. He gets a desk, and he also gets loads of work to do. Now, because John hasn't had a job for a long time, he's really happy to have a lot of work. And in fact, he gets through that work really effectively, and people give him more work, and he carries on doing it, and he gets through everything. And life is going well. One day, several months later, the boss calls John into his office, and he says, I'm getting quite old, I'm tired. I would really like to leave now and retire. And he asks John to take over. And John says, oh, yes, please, thank you. And he takes the boss's job. The boss goes away and retires. The other people in the company are really happy. They've got their new boss, John. There's lots of work. They look up to him in admiration. They're like, wow, you're amazing, John. Things are really great since you arrived. However, I told you this was a sad story. Unfortunately, the stock market crashed and the work dried up. And John had the very difficult job of inviting his colleagues into his office and having to lay them off one by one. Sorry, there's no more work for you. Sorry, there's no more work for you. And even he ended up right back where he started, in his house, in his bed, with no work. So that story lends itself then to a controlled practice activity using multi-verb or phrasal verbs, whichever you prefer. Again, check it out on the website. I'm happy to share all of this with you. So we've got the text. Now, obviously, I talk through it in a slightly different way. It's up to you as a teacher to improvise how much language you put in it or not. And students are then going to be using these phrasal verbs to fill in the gaps. Now, hopefully you noticed when I was telling the story, certain phrasal verbs like lay off, I was physically lying and taking off that rod. So this was how we were using it for talking about phrasal verbs with work. This idea originally came from Making Sense of Phrasal Verbs, a brilliant book with Martin Shovel. It's got lots of different pictures in, and teachers in particular, Jennifer at IH Cordoba, been using it for years with students, and I really enjoy telling it, and they then work on it. And obviously after that, you can start doing anything further practice with these verbs. So that is a story using vocabulary. What about stories that get grammar? So this is a setup for another story. Again, unfortunately, the theme is a little bit depressing. This story is perhaps more aimed at older learners, so you might want to adapt or change some of the content to make it more appropriate if you're looking at younger learners. But essentially, we need some characters. And you can see, I'll tell you this story again here, so some pictures of me telling the story. But the main character is going to be called Lucy. And we just need 5 rods here. So we're going to have a black rod to represent Peter and Peter's house, a green rod for Martin and Martin's house. William is in the yellow. Lucy has got the sort of pinky purple color. And then we can use another one to represent David and his boat. And we've also got a river down the middle, as you can see. So these are the different characters that we need for our story. This is the story of our character, Lucy. And importantly, there's a river here where Lucy lives. Lucy lives on this side of the river, and her close friend, William, who is a ray of sunshine, a really lovely guy, he lives on the same side as the river as Lucy. Opposite, we have got Martin. Martin likes the environment, so we're using the colors to be a bit stereotyped. He's an eco person. And we've got a black character over here. This is Peter. He's known locally as being a bit of a playboy. He likes women and he's not worried about how many women. And then we've got our character here, David. David has a little boat which will take people across the river. So here's the story. So one day, Lucy went and talked to her friend William, and she said, I'm feeling really sad. I've been single for a really long time. I'd really like to meet somebody, have a good time. What do you think I should do? And William, being a good friend, suggests Martin. He said, well, why don't you go and, talk to Martin, spend a bit of time. He's a really nice guy, really lovely. I think he's great. And Lucy says, well, what about Peter? William says straight away, you don't want to be going to Peter's house. Peter's had hundreds of girlfriends in the last month, and you don't want to be going there. You're a really nice girl, Lucy. Think about Martin. Well, Lucy's a girl that doesn't always listen. She decides that she's going to go across the river anyway, and she's quite interested to see whether Peter really is the playboy that people think he is. So she goes to the river and she talks to David, the ferryboat guy, and she says, I'd like to go across the river. I'm going to spend some time. And he said, that's fine, I can take you. But the problem is tomorrow's Sunday and I don't work on Sunday. So if I take you now, you need to come back early enough for me to get you back across the river. Otherwise you could be stuck on the other side. And Lucy's like, yeah, that's fine, all good. So David and Lucy cross the river and David goes back and he goes off to do his own thing for the rest of the day. Now, Lucy decides to knock on Peter's door, and Peter is very happy to see a woman arrive on his doorstep, uninvited, more than happy for her to come in. And Lucy gets a bit carried away and ends up spending the entire night at Peter's house, not thinking anything about how she's going to get home. In the morning, Peter's already fed up with Lucy. He knows he's got some other girls that are going to be coming and visiting. So he says, sorry, Lucy, I've got some other stuff to do. Bye. And Lucy is left in the cold outside. And she doesn't know what to do because she's realized she can't get back across the river at this point. So she decides that William's told her that Martin is a really nice guy. She'll go to Martin's house, ring the bell, and explain the situation. Martin actually really likes Lucy. And he lets her in, they have a cup of tea. But when Martin knows that Lucy has just spent the night with Peter, whom he doesn't trust or like, he loses a bit of respect for Lucy. And because he doesn't want to get hurt, he decides to sort of say, well, I'm really sorry, but I have actually got something. I've got some people coming over later. I'm really sorry, I can't help very much, but it's nice of you to pop in. And Lucy has to leave. She's stuck on this side of the river and she's got to make a choice. How does she get home? Is she going to wait in the cold until the next morning when David turns up with the boat? What are the other options? Well, Lucy decides that she's actually a really good swimmer and actually she could just swim across the river, get soaking wet, dry off when she gets home. End of story, she'll be back. She gets into the river and she starts to swim. But sadly, because this is a sad story, the river currents take her away and Lucy is no more. Lucy drowns. So this story is going to ask you an important question. Oh, if they don't all fall down. So who is responsible for Lucy's death? Is it William, the good friend that she didn't listen to and didn't take his advice? Is it David, who maybe should have not taken her across the river in the first place if he wasn't going to be able to pick her up and bring her back? Is it Peter, who messed with her emotions and sent her out in the cold? Or Martin, that wasn't kind enough to keep her? Or, in fact, is it Lucy herself? Okay, so that story is now brilliant for my favourite grammar structure, which is if we ask who is responsible for Lucy's death and we start our sentence, we could start here with the word if Lucy, and then ask the students what they're going to come up with. Now, most students are going to say something like, if Lucy had, for example, listened to William, and then we're eliciting the structure. She wouldn't have drowned. And there I have my fabulous favourite third conditional. So I can have a look there. I've got my if, and we've got had listened. So we've got here our past perfect. Okay, our past perfect. And then we've got our modal auxiliary here, wouldn't. And then we've got have drowned, our perfect infinitive. Not present perfect, because this one cannot be changed to has. So it's have plus our past participle, which is a perfect infinitive. And this particular story is going to give you loads and loads of examples. You can play around with it with your students. You can also make mixed conditionals, think about the sequence of events. So, and there are lots of other similar stories. All of the Shakespeare tragedies are brilliant for third conditional, and you can tell them with Cuisenaire rods. Okay, so let's think about pronunciation. Pronunciation, Adrian Underhill has some fantastic videos and talks about this in his Sound Foundation book. But what we're going to do is we use simply the red rods to represent the main stress and the white ones to represent the less stressed syllables. And you need groups of students to do this. And what you're going to get them to do is divide the class into thirds. The first third is going to be saying 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. The second third, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. And notice how we can start turning this into our schwa sound because it's unstressed. So these are schwas, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and a 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a 4, and a 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a 4. And we can see how these also come together where we are keeping a nice rhythm and we're joining them up with getting a Anna, Anna 1, Anna 1, Anna 2, Anna 3, Anna 4. If all the students start at the same time, saying 1, 2, 3, 4, or 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, or and a 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a 4. And just to confuse everyone, you get them to repeat that 4 times using your fingers. So going 1, 2, 3, 4, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and a 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a 4. And they're repeating the same thing over. You will find that despite the fact that this group has more to say, they should finish at exactly the same time as the group that only says 1, 2, 3, 4. And that's because English is a stress time language where we put the stress on regular syllables. Again, I would really direct you to the work of Adrian Underhill. He's got some great things, and he also does this really well with nursery rhymes and poems, things like Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall, listening to the regular beats, the regular timing. If you were not a stress-timed language, like a syllable-timed language, like my husband being an Italian, he wouldn't say and a 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a 4. He'd say and a 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a 4. And then we're going to take a lot longer to say it. So that can highlight the difference. So we can look overall at the rhythm of a language. We can look at individual sounds as well, word stress. So here the rods are representing a single word, in this case, a 2-syllable word. So each rod for 1 syllable. So this word, the first syllable will be stressed and the second syllable unstressed. Here, the first syllable unstressed, the second syllable stressed. How do we practice this? So here's an example. Again, all the worksheets are on the website. Please use them with your students to raise awareness. So what we've got here is the case where we have a noun or a verb. So we produce, produce. We refuse, refuse. We import, imports. We record, records. We suspect, suspects. And what you would do here, first of all, with a pen and paper, I will ask students to literally recognize where the stress is. So as a teacher, I will choose to read some of these. So I might say produce, refuse, import, record, suspect. And I would ask the student to write down the according number. So I said produce, they would write 1A. I said refuse, they write 2B. I said import, they write 1C, etc. And they record this. And then you can test it by literally asking them to show you with the rods. So each student is going to be given 2 rods. They'll get a little white one, a little red one. The teacher says a word, and the students place the rods according to where they hear the stress. So this is an awareness raising activity. And in this case, where we place the stress is going to change the meaning. I would say that what's really important with this is that students have a context. So like the pictures, and as soon as you put the word in a whole sentence, even if they misplace the stress a bit, it should be clear which word they are meaning, whether it's the noun or the verb. So this is an example of word stress. Another thing we can do is what we call corrective stress or contrastive stress. And here we just need a few more rods. In this case, each rod represents one word, not a syllable, a single word. So this is the we, and this is the are, and driving, and to the cinema tonight. So we're going to put out the rods, and we want to move the red rod into different positions to make our sentences mean different things. So this simple sentence, we're driving to the cinema tonight, depending how I say it, could mean any of these things. So listen, we're driving to the cinema tonight. We, not them. We're driving to the cinema tonight. Okay, we're driving. We're not taking the bus. We are driving to the cinema tonight. You don't believe me. We're driving to the cinema tonight, not the pub. We're driving to the cinema tonight, but we're not returning by car. We're driving to the cinema tonight, not tomorrow. Now, what's important is this is just a little thing, but for example, for a student, if they weren't to hear this emphasis of we're driving to the cinema, they might think that they were getting a lift in both directions, and then they find that they're left in town at the cinema and everybody goes to the pub and there is no lift home because they haven't heard the key word. With the rods, how do we practice this? Again, the teacher models a sentence, the students move this. So this one here is showing sentence number 3, the you don't believe me. We are driving. So that's this one. Again, you could ask the students to lay out the rods, move it and model for each other, or say a sentence and their partner puts the rod where they think they heard the stress. So not all languages do this kind of corrective, contrastive stress, and this is a really nice way to raise awareness. Okay, so we've looked at lots of ways of doing things. Another really simple thing that you can do with Cuisenaire rods is just use them to do some signaling in your classroom. A fantastic practitioner called Simon Lind did a webinar a while back talking for CUP, and he was talking about how he gets students to RAG rate, if you've heard this term. So RAG comes from red, amber, and green, which is the colors of our traffic lights, red, amber, green. And he gets people to RAG rate their participation and their understanding. So one thing that they can do is they can type a word in the chat box. If he's teaching grammar, they can type red when they're saying, stop, 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 I need some more time. Or he'll say, how was that exercise for you? And they type in amber, and they are showing, or orange, whichever you want to call it, saying, I need you to clarify this, do it a bit further. Or green, let's move straight on. In the classroom, you can simply ask the students to take the rod, have all these 3 rods on their table, and at the end of an activity say, right, where are you? Are you red, green, amber? Place it on the table. Let's decide whether we're doing more practice or not. I also use this for correction. I think it really highlights and raises awareness. So here, the red is, please don't correct me. I'm feeling a bit sensitive, nervous. I don't want to know about my mistakes. The orange one is, can you point out just important mistakes? and green for go, correct everything. Usually this is a great way of raising awareness. The first time I place the rods on the table, everybody chooses the green, they all put it there, and I correct absolutely everything that comes out of their mouths or on their pens, pencil, whatever they've done. And very quickly, students see the benefit of not being corrected all the time for everything, but to be more specific about, are we going for fluency? Are we going for accuracy? And maybe they're going to choose the perfect place, which is orange. Let me as a teacher decide whether this mistake is worth correcting or not. Is this the moment to correct the mistake? So we can use rods to get feedback on what students want or need in the classroom. Now, we're going to sort of end by thinking about a completely different approach as well. We're thinking about the silent way. We talked about this man last time, Caleb Gattegno, who really popularized Cuisenaire rods after Georges Cuisenaire, a Belgian mathematician, showed him. And he worked intensively with children in classrooms and saw that the rods were a fantastic way of creating good language use and good engagement. And he designed a method called the silent way. And it is what it says on the packet. It's quite silent. There is a website here that you can go to look at it, and there are numerous videos on the web, and I've put links again in documents that are on Gallery Teachers. But in order to do the silent way, you need what is called a Fidel chart. This chart gives basically color coding, and the color coding is related to pronunciation. This is the American phonemic chart, and each of these will represent a particular sound. Now, I've never actually been able to use this myself. It's not something I can get my head around, but a lot of people have brilliant success with it. If you can associate each color with a sound, you can start to learn how to pronounce different words. So each of these words have got their different. So brown is going to be orange, inge. We've got certain sounds going on here. And what Gattegno did was he used the pointer and a large chart, and he directed students around the chart to start building up sentences. What he also did was he got students to work together in small groups, intimate groups, as we did just when we were talking about dogme, saying about building stories or building little sentences, grammatical structures, just by holding up a single rod and asking the student what it might represent. And then the teacher being, for the most part, very silent, using a lot of pointing, a lot of gesture. This is a fantastic thing to look into. Again, if you're doing Delta experimental practice, there's a lot about it. You can trial it, have a go with your students. I do think it's a really good way to be reflective and to reduce teacher talking time. Let's just summarize sort of the pros and cons as well, because some people put some questions in feedback and chat after the last webinar. One thing to think about is that people often say, well, aren't they just a gimmick? Aren't they just a toy? Aren't the students just going to be playing with things? Well, actually, the Scientific American Journal has done some research into this and said that fidget toys aren't just hype. So you can see this is a fidget spinner, and you've got thinking putty. Well, Cuisenaire rods, in a way, I guess, are a fidget toy, and they are something that you want to hold and manipulate. Whilst I'm talking to you, it's nice touching and feeling this rod. Actually, they're really useful with students, particularly students, for example, that maybe have something like ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. They may find it useful to have this focus whilst they're working. And actually, it's not going to be a distraction. So I've used Cuisenaire rods on many, many occasions, and very rarely found that students are wholly distracted and mess around with them. Another question that was raised is about also the problem of associating different colors to rods. So there are a very small minority of people that have grapheme color synesthesia. And in this case, it means that you associate a particular letter or a number with a color. Now, whilst I haven't any experience of this myself, I do actually have a colleague whose daughter has this, and she has said that it hasn't been a big problem, but really that you just, as we said in our first webinar, need to agree with students when you're holding the rods, you know, what color is this? And I've just picked two out of the same box, and actually, if you look at them closely, they're not exactly the same color. One is sort of more pinky purple. I think if you agree with the students what the color is in the first place, you're unlikely to have a problem. So these are perhaps little pitfalls or things that people talk about as not being great with rods. Okay, so let's just end this webinar with the benefits of Cuisenaire rods. I had a massive list. I've cut it down just to sort of things I think that are key points why you should go away from this webinar and have a go immediately, and also watch the previous webinar for the first time or again so that you can start to use this. I think that hopefully you've seen that rods can show simple patterns and concepts and highlight things. And that's a really nice way for students to work reflectively and cognitively. And that means it's going to go into their long-term memory. They are really great for visual, kinesthetic, cognitive learning. I think it's good that the focus is taken off the teacher and on the rods. Probably when you were listening to the story, you were looking more at the rods than at my face. And certainly if you're working on word stress or sentence stress, you're going to be looking at the rods and listening as well. And that can be really nice. So teacher talking time, I'm really guilty of it, even after 25 odd years. You can reduce it with rods. And if you're brave and clever, you can even be silent and use the silent way. The rods are really hard wearing, they're practical, and you just don't need to prepare anything. Once you've done it once or twice, I know that I can have that box of rods with me. I can put a webcam on and do a little story, or I can go into a physical classroom and I've got loads of lessons in there. And the most important thing for me is that it is memorable, it's engaging, and it is fun. If a lesson is memorable, that's brilliant, and memorable for the right reasons. And you can say to students, right, do you remember when we got the rods out? Do you remember Lucy? What did we say about Lucy? And students will remember and do remember. I really hope that you've enjoyed this webinar today and that you found it useful. Would direct you towards all of the useful the Gallery Teachers website with the ELT resources and all of the handouts and different information and materials that are on them. So do you need to practice to use rods properly? First of all, what is your definition of properly? I think you need to use them in an engaging way, and it needs to be clear visually. So if you're working online, it's worth opening a Zoom call with yourself or a similar call, recording yourself using the rods and deciding, do they need to see your face? Do they just need to see the table and the rods laid out? What position might you put the camera or visualizer in? If you're doing it face to face, if you have a colleague or family member or friend who's prepared to play with you for a little bit and watch you do it, you can have a go and see what they think, if the message you're getting across is the message that they're hearing. So yeah, practice obviously is going to make you more confident and reduce teacher anxiety. But I do think that it is the impromptu nature of rods, their spontaneity, the fact that things go wrong, that the rods might fall over, that you say something a bit differently. I have done the story, some of the stories in this webinar many, many times, and every single time they're slightly different. Does it matter? No. Hopefully they're still engaging and memorable. So if your school doesn't have a budget for this kind of resource, would I recommend investing in them? I have to say, absolutely, yes, I would. I would personally recommend investing in a box of rods over and above any number of books or subscriptions or apps that you can buy, just because they are such a versatile, hard-wearing tool. I've been teaching for around 25 years. I got my first set of rods very early on in my teaching career. They look exactly the same as when I first bought them, and that's not for lack of use. They are really, really hard-wearing. So if you're going to get many, many, many lessons, loads of pleasure, loads of learning out of something, I wholly think it's worth the investment. Also, I think that you should ask the people that have the budget to watch these webinars and see what you can really do with them. And if you can accelerate student learning with that small investment, which is much smaller than the cost of many other resources that are available, then hopefully you can maybe convince the people with the money to change their minds.